Welcome to Integral Talks, a podcast series brought to you by Integral Advisors, where we dive into the world of compliance, risk management, and due diligence, and provide you with expert insight and analysis to help you make more informed business decisions. Hello and welcome back to our podcast. I'm your host, Alberto de la Portilla. As always, thank you for tuning in and for subscribing. Since Donald Trump returned to the White House, the general mood in the business community has been primarily favorable. Already one can see certain sectors responding well in the U.S. Companies in telecommunication, healthcare, and the financial services sector lead year-to-date performance in the S&P 500. A more business-friendly, deregulated environment in theory should facilitate trade, but there's been a lot of noise coming out of Washington that may present some challenges. Threats of tariffs against trading partners near and far are likely to impact business prospects. Already, the Trump administration has imposed 25% tariffs on the import of steel and aluminum. How will the new administration affect mergers and acquisition opportunities specifically for cross-border deals between the U.S. and Latin America? That's a topic of our podcast today. I'm excited to invite Nicholas Rodríguez to our podcast. Nicholas is a partner in Winston Strawn's Miami office and has over 20 years of experience with a focus on complex domestic and cross-border M&A transactions in the energy, financial, media, and telecommunications sectors, among others. He's been recognized in recent years as a leading corporate M&A attorney by Legal 500 Latin America and Latin Lawyer. Nicholas, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Alberto. It's always great to chat with you and talk business and other things. So thanks for having me on the show.
Well, it's wonderful. I want to there's a lot to cover, right? There's so much happening. But let's start big picture. You do this every day. You represent clients in the region on cross-border deals. So today, where do you see kind of the most immediate opportunities in Latin America for U.S. companies during a Trump's 2.0 term?
Well, I think if we were talking back in November, we would probably be having a different discussion. I think Trump has been pretty direct in how he viewed the U.S. Vis-a-vis other countries and globally, and as it relates to Latin America. And I think he's followed through on some of the things that he's talked about, right? He's talked about making America great again, protecting America, allowing America to be independent, protecting our borders, and being tougher on crime. And I think he's followed through on that, and trade deficits and other issues. So I think he's followed through on that. I think that's thrown everyone back for a loop. Just thrown everyone back a bit, just to see how things play out. So back in November, I think people were very excited, particularly in the business community. I think 2024, it was a strong quarter, and you were seeing a lot more M&A activity with the election of Trump. I think people were excited that things were, again, kind of going in the right direction. And it's based on what you said earlier, viewing it through a market-friendly lens, right? The issue, though, is now with the discussion of tariffs, and not just discussion, it's actually now real, right? Although it's been paused or set aside for 30 days as it relates to Canada and Mexico, but the imposition of tariffs on aluminum, steel. Today, there was an announcement that there will be reciprocal tariffs applying to many, many countries. Apparently, they have to review and evaluate and see how that's going to be implemented. So there's more on the way. And what happens, that creates uncertainty. That said, putting all of that aside, I think there's still a lot of opportunity, and just capitalizing on that, I think that helps M&A from the perspective of, I think what you'll see is a lot of family offices, private equity investors in Latin America, and companies want to diversify their portfolio and diversify or risk mitigate their dependence on being in Latin America. So you'll see them investing more in the U.S. and Europe. So I think that's an upside that people don't take into account. We saw that a couple of years ago with the emergence of all these left-leaning governments in Latin America, where there was just capital flight. And we've seen it significantly in Florida, Miami, because Florida has just been sort of the launching point for many of these LATAM investors, where they use it as a beachhead and invest a lot to the US and in Europe as well. So I think that's an upside. But that wasn't your question. Well, what's the low hanging fruit? The low hanging fruit is, I think it's still the usual suspects, right? I think it's definitely technology. I think since and even before COVID, but since COVID, you saw the emergence of all these tech companies, startups. Uruguay is viewed as sort of the Silicon Valley of Latin America. So you've seen a significant amount of growth in these countries in the tech space, as well as like in the fintech space. So I think you're going to continue to see that in Latin America, and you'll see a lot of investment from U.S. and global and international investors. I think you have the agricultural sector is still very hot and something that people focus on. And given that food prices are going up, I think that's an area that people will continue to look at. Project infrastructure, there's a significant need for project infrastructure in Latin America. I think some of the latest estimates I've seen is at least $250 billion per year of investment is needed in Latin America just to sort of keep up, and not to be state of the art, just to keep up. You and I travel significantly in Latin America, so I think we've actually seen it firsthand.
Exactly.
The advent of or the increase of data and AI and telecommunications, I think that's going to require a lot of digital infrastructure like data centers, and you're seeing the growth of data centers in Latin America. So I think that's another big space. Energy is another significant one, and I think that could go one of two ways. One is, I think there have been a number of governments that have announced a more of a focus on renewable energy, sustainable energy. I don't know how long that'll last, even if they're, like Colombia's a perfect example. It has significant amounts of resources in energy, in oil and gas, and the president wanted to sort of get away from that and go into more renewable energy. So there's still an opportunity there. And I think depending on what the U.S. does and with its policies, it might attract more energy requirements from countries like Brazil and Mexico and Chile that have significant energy resources.
Yeah, I mean, you hit one thing that really struck a chord with me is fintechs and in general financial services. That what I've seen is that the demographics of Latin America are changing, and it's a general population that's getting older. They have more needs. The younger ones are coming to the States, and they are staying in the U.S. most of the time. And so you have an older population that's going to need access to financial services, either through fintechs. And I think they're much more open to it given, since COVID, right? So, and everyone has a smartphone. But healthcare, do you think healthcare, I mean, there is a need as you get older to have better healthcare. Is healthcare an industry that you think is going to pop over the next few years as far as M&A opportunities?
So let's talk about, it's funny, I left that off my list, and it's one that I kind of have been reflecting on. And the reason I left it off my list, Alberto, is this. I think about Colombia. Colombia is a perfect example where I think over the last few years, you've seen a significant amount of investment in the healthcare space, from international investors, private equity investors, over the last, since the new president is coming into power. There have been, announcements on change at healthcare laws and regulations, which have given people cold feet, and they've just kind of pushed away. And I think you've seen that in certain other countries in Latin America. But again, I think given how large these populations are, how large these countries are, there's always going to be a demand and a need for healthcare. So I think that's, an area that I think will attract investors. The one other thing that I didn't mention that I think is important that there will be a significant amount of opportunity, and it depends on how it all shakes out based on all the rhetoric and everything that's happening now, geopolitically wise, and with respect to other things. But nearshoring is another significant opportunity where I think post-COVID, and with Ukraine and all these geopolitical wars and issues, people have realized that we need to focus on our supply chain, and we need to mitigate the risk and issues with transportation and logistics and costs. And so I think people have been, and companies have been, evaluating that over the last few years. I think you've seen a significant amount of investment in Mexico in that respect. I know a number of clients and other third parties that have used Mexico as a launching point. I think you would see that Costa Rica, Central America, because of its in the proximity to the U.S. and the Americas. You'll see that, and I think that's another area where you might see a significant amount of growth there and investment.
And so you mentioned supply chain. So let's talk about tariffs, right? The big T word. I did see the news as well that the reciprocal tariffs are potentially coming in a lot of different with a lot of different countries. U.S. companies, and I know there's uncertainty, but if you can look at a crystal ball, and if you tell your clients, like U.S. companies engaging in cross-border transactions with a view to Latin America should prepare for what with vis-a-vis these tariffs? I mean, increased costs, supply chain disruptions, complexity around regulatory issues. Like what should U.S. Companies interested in M&A, what should they expect?
Well, I think you outlined it perfectly. I mean, I think it's all of the above. I think it's, again, it's not rhetoric. It's being played out. And it's a poker game, right? It's who's going to fold, who's going to push ahead, what are the implications. I think what you'll see is in the short term and near term, there will be a significant amount of uncertainty in how you navigate these issues.
Do you see, sorry to interrupt you, but do you see companies kind of taking a more of a wait and see approach for the next 3 to 6 months, or what are you seeing now?
Without a doubt. I would suspect at a minimum it would be 3 to 6 months just to see how it plays out. And I think, Alberto, the biggest issue there is, as a buyer, right? How do you value a company that now has the prospect of tariffs being imposed, right? How do you factor that into revenues and compare that to historical information that you're looking at when there were no tariffs? And what are the implications going forward? And so as a responsible buyer that's showing restraint, even though you want to do deals, as a responsible buyer, how do you value that? And I think that's what happens, right? It starts to create the valuation disconnect, number one. I mean, even if you get to the point where you'll say to yourself, you know what, I'm a gambler, I'm a risk taker, the price is right, let's talk about price. How do you value that, right? And even if you try to come up with an alternative method of valuation, let's say valuation. Earnout. Let's talk about an earnout or a way to bridge this valuation gap. There's so much uncertainty there that you couldn't even price it, right? How do you price the earnout? How do you know where you're going to end up and what the right numbers are? So I think that creates a lot of uncertainty, and I think that's what will chill, deal making in the short term in those specific sectors. I think that'll create a lot of pause, and people will be like, I think right now folks are scrambling, trying to assess what is the implication of all this, right? And how does it affect, and is there a way to get around this?
Right. And the news that came out today about these retaliatory tariffs, are they focused, is the administration focusing more on certain countries, or is it certain industries?
So based on the limited amount that I read,
Of course, yeah.
it's they're going to look across the board, whether you're an ally or not. They just want to see what are you doing as it relates. What is country X doing as it relates to pricing and tariffs on goods, and should we implement the same tariffs so that we can
Right.
even the playing field? And so,
Right.
and again, and then what does that result in, right? Who do we pass the cost to? Are we passing it down to the consumer? Does that affect sales? And should we be looking at another type of business, like a services business that maybe won't have, that won't be affected by these implications? But I think they're even looking at how does VAT, the imposition of VAT from let's say European or a non-U.S. country, how does that impact? So, I think that's what the administration will look at, and they'll say, well, if they have to pay a VAT and that increases pricing, well, we should, have a similar tariff on ours. But it's a wait and see approach.
Yeah, and I think I mean, you said earlier, and I think you're spot on in terms of this is like a poker game, and a lot of noise is out there, and it's going to get a reaction, and hopefully, the administration gets the reaction that it is favorable to the U.S. Before it has to actually implement and execute these tariffs. But I mean, he's a deal maker, and I think he's using all of the available tools at his disposal to just get the things he wants, to happen. So I want to,
and it's worked, right, Alberto? When you think about
so far,
I mean, when you think about, right, regardless of where you stand from an ideological perspective, it to a certain degree it's worked, right? When he said to Mexico and Canada, all right, we're imposing these tariffs. I'm sorry, we've been friends for a long time, but now we have to do things a certain way, and I want border security, and there's a drug issue, and enforcement of the immigration laws, and XYZ, and whatever else. And there was some rhetoric that responses right away, but then the immediate response is, all right, well, how will this impact us from? To me, money and economics talks, right? So what is the implication from a dollar perspective? How is this going to affect our businesses? And they blinked first, and they said, all right, we'll do what you need us to do to get you comfortable. And so that was set aside for 30 days. I think they'll revisit it on March 1st. So yeah, I think what's interesting to me. It's sort of the only thing that's certain right now is there's a lot of uncertainty. That's the only thing right now. And when you think about it, he's only been, I think today will mark his 25th. Yeah, it's been, we're not talking about a lot of time, right? So
I got to say it's exhausting just keeping up with the news. Yeah.
Right. So I do think it will have a chilling effect. On the other hand, to my point earlier, I think the inverse of that or the opposite effect is you may see more M&A, outbound M&A or inbound M&A coming into the U.S. or Europe from these Latin American companies that want to diversify their risk.
Yeah, that's an interesting prediction. I'm always thinking about.
We saw it like post-COVID. We saw it with
sure, yeah.
When
and you're right, and whenever there's a change in government, I mean, Colombia has taken a left turn, and you started to see Colombian capital flight coming into the States. It always does. It has for years, not just Colombia, but all these Venezuela, all these countries that there has been quite a bit of capital flight that comes here to park itself here, because this is at the end of the day the U.S. dollar. It's the most stable economy in the world, and
just to
as far as go ahead. I'm sorry.
An example, Alberto. I was born in Colombia, and being of Colombian descent, still have a lot of family and friends, and there were a number of individuals that I know of right before the new president came into power in Colombia, that they were like, it's going to be okay, and they didn't take their money out, and they probably lost like 20 or 30%. And again, it's currency exchange, and other factors that affect that in reality affect. But then you had, on the other hand, there were so many workshops and conferences where there were like Colombians lined up to invest in real estate and other hard assets here in the U.S., particularly in Florida, or in Chile with with the new administration there. We had Chilean clients that we were talking about. All right, how do we restructure? We already lived this. We've already gone through this with prior presidents, so we know what we have to do. But what do you think of this tax structuring, and how do we address these issues? And again, it's risk diversification, right? You're trying to mitigate this potential risk issue.
Yeah, I was talking to someone in Colombia last week, just going back to the issue of the tariffs. And if you recall, a couple of weeks ago, there was an incident where the U.S. wanted to send illegal, immigrants back to Colombia, and the president said no, and then Trump threatened 25% tariffs, and that I think happened. I think it was like a 24-hour period before Petro, bit the bullet and said, "Fine, we'll accept it." Which I think he showed how naive he was there. But
well, and I love the way he recasted it. We'll send our presidential plane so that there's some dignity involved.
But when I was talking to a businessman who has a successful clothing manufacturer and exporter, they export a lot of clothing to the U.S., and he started receiving all of these. He started reaching out to his customers, and they said, "Keep the inventory. We're not buying anything until this thing gets resolved." And it got resolved in 24 hours or 48 hours. But that's the immediate reaction that you're right. It's going to have a chilling effect in the very, very short term, where potentially U.S. buyers of products from these countries are going to just hold it. We'll figure it out. Let's wait till this passes. So.
And then it's just the layering effect, right? the carrying costs of that inventory, not selling it. How does that affect the clothing manufacturer? Then locally, you have to sell products. How do you? So are you buying something that's a little bit more expensive and passing that on to the customer? So it does start to have implications.
Yeah, a kind of a domino effect on the market, on that particular market. I want to talk about some of the news that I've seen. I think last week, Wall Street Journal first reported it, and then some other newspapers, is you're seeing a kind of dialing back on the Department of Justice enforcement of foreign on the FCPA. I don't know if you came across that, but the DOJ is going to focus not so much on Russian oligarchs and foreign corruption by U.S. companies doing business abroad, but they're going to bring it closer to home and focus more on transnational crime, but also the Mexican drug cartels. That's a number one priority for the new DOJ under the Attorney General. That, for me, as a kind of risk manager and who focuses on doing due diligence for clients, and they get themselves in a lot of trouble because there's issues related to allegations of bribery and corruption overseas, where until a week ago the U.S. made that a number one priority, is now kind of pulling back, which is again consistent with this sort of more business friendly environment that Trump wants to. And I think the actual terms that they're going to have more reasonable enforcement guidelines, and that's also having a little bit of an effect on companies. Some are saying this is great, but then their outside, their counsels are saying, wait a second, this is you can't just do business like like other countries might. So I don't know if you've heard about that or if you have any opinion about
so
that.
It's interesting. That it's a great question, Alberto. But I remember I want to say maybe probably 20 years ago, when I was living in New York, I was part of a committee on the New York City Bar Association, and we wrote at the committee it was an M&A, I believe it was an M&A committee. We wrote a paper on FCPA, and back then, I think it was about 20 years ago. And one of the aspects of the article was, the frustration of U.S. companies that felt that they were being penalized more than their counterparts, and let's say their Chinese counterparts, or even back then their European counterparts, who one there may have been laws in place, but they weren't enforced as they were being enforced in the U.S. And so they felt like these U.S. companies felt like they were at a disadvantage in terms of operating, on a global basis in comparison to some of these other countries. And I think there is some reality. There is some truth to that, right? I think if you look at, the last 10 years, there has been much more robust enforcement in Europe. Chinese, it depends, right? How you want to view that, but there has been much more robust enforcement, definitely in the U.S. and definitely in Europe. I think what's going to happen is, to your point, I think you said it perfectly. Companies, it's not just like laissez-faire and we can do whatever we want, and there's no principle around, and so parents are asleep at the wheel, and so we can do whatever we want. I think and again, the reality is we're going to need to see what the details are and what they say on these things. And I think companies will have to work with their outside counsel or in-house counsel to figure out, how do we refreshen our compliance programs and our compliance policies to ensure that we're not running afoul of the law, intentionally, directly, and just to ensure that there are no issues, right? Because I think, the one thing that I think companies are much more sensitive now is, look, there's a penalty, right? When you run afoul of the law, right? There's a penalty, but then there's also, what is the social impact in the sense that, there's so much social media, right? As soon as you do something wrong, how will that impact? And, there's a price on that, right? And then the energy of just trying to manage it from an optics perspective, right? So I think companies are always sensitive to that. This also depends on the sector and the business that you're involved in, but it's a sensitive issue. So it's the interplay. But obviously, with Trump 2.0, he's telling us there's certain things that I really care about, and there are other things that I don't care about, right? I think one of the excitement, one of the areas where people were excited about, in terms of, especially from the perspective of an M&A deal maker, practitioner, or advisor, is they felt that with this new, with Trump 2.0, what we were going to get is, it was just going to be a much more market-friendly environment, and M&A was just going to be falling out of the sky. It was just going to be everywhere. Right? You just pick it up in the street, and again, I think there was a lot of excitement, especially the way 2024 was ending. But I think he's also told us that there are certain things that are important for him, right, for Trump. So when you think about enforcement issues and DOJ and FTC and antitrust, again, I think, even when he was in office, there was enforcement on some of these issues, particularly in the tech sector. There was definitely enforcement on large mergers and the impact. How is it going to impact on consumers? I think part of the issue is, how are they going to evaluate transactions? Are they going to go back to the more traditional way of analyzing these M&A transactions and deals and how it impacts consumers? Or are they going to look at other aspects, right, like labor and other impacts? But there definitely is still, and Trump and his advisor have mentioned it. So, for example, let me read a quote in the press release that came out last week, where it was a press release involving the appointment of Daniel Guaneta as director of the Bureau of Competition, and he was. And I'm sorry, my phone's going off in the background. I don't know if you hear it, but anyway, I won't let that detract me. But in the announcement, Chairman Ferguson praised Guaneta's experience in litigating antitrust cases in critical markets, including agriculture and big tech, and described labor and healthcare markets as two of his top priorities. So again, I don't think it's what people are expecting, where it'll be completely business friendly. I think, as it relates to enforcement of M&A transactions, I think they'll try to find other tools and techniques, which you didn't see much in the Biden administration, where it's like, I think once they determined a deal was not going to meet, their antitrust scrutiny, was over. Whereas I think, in prior administrations, there was a way to can we sell off part of the business? Can we put conditions? Can we put restrictions? And I think they were much more flexible. I think we'll see that more under the Trump administration than just, an all out, we're not going to do any deals or approve any deals. But I think there will be enforcement. I don't think it'll be completely unfettered approval on transactions.
Yeah, I don't think so. I certainly know that the priorities are different than this than previous administration, and you're right. I mean, I think what's happening at the border, what's happening with the cartels, the influx of fentanyl that's coming in from Mexico, I think that continues to be a high priority, and that's going to dictate, particularly, foreign policy towards Mexico, and the DOJ's mission in terms of what are they pursuing, what are they prioritizing. Interesting that Russian oligarchs have no longer a priority to the U.S. government when, they have been. We'll see how that plays out geopolitically, right?
And again, maybe again, not saying whether I approve or disapprove, but
no, not saying right or wrong. Just
right, exactly. It's just the interplay of the negotiation of how do we resolve this Ukraine-Russia conflict.
True.
Right? And how do we, and maybe that's the first step to try to get get some finality.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I mean, I think everything that Trump does, for the most part, you have to look at it like there is other layers to this. There's other intentions and there's a purpose to this. I mean, there's some of it is, what it is, right? It's just to throw red meat out there to the base. But others is like, that's a great point that you just make, that it could be part on the chessboard, it could be one of the pieces.
Absolutely.
Exactly. I bringing it back to our region, Latin America. I want to ask you about, like, which countries do you see? I mean, I have my opinion, but I want to hear yours about which countries do you see kind of benefiting most under a Trump 2.0. So just some data for you to consider before you respond. So already you're seeing the stock exchange in Argentina, I think it's called the Merval, and then the Bovespa in Brazil having extremely strong, first quarter to start the year. There seems to be foreign investment going into those countries in things like mining, particularly Argentina, as those economies continue to improve and, in the case of Argentina, stabilize. Argentina and Brazil, I mean, is that a sign of things to come? Do you see other countries benefiting under in the next 4 years with Trump as president?
I'm sure that when Trump was announced as the winner,
Milei was doing cartwheels.
I think there's an alignment there of policies and politics. I think Milei, he's done a pretty good job of stabilizing in the short term, right? And we've had a lot of ups and downs with Argentina, but again, it's such a country with so much potential. Like, if you think back to the 80s and the early 90s, I mean, Argentina was one of the more, progressive, sophisticated countries. I mean, there was a lot happening there. It's an absolutely beautiful country, and again, rich in natural resources. So I suspect they're going to be a beneficiary. I'll pause in Brazil for a second. The other one that seems to be now getting, and it's smaller, but El Salvador. It seems like there's some interesting or overlapping ideologies. That people that and Rubio was there recently, and it seemed like they hit it off, and so I think there's some opportunity there. Now, when you think of M&A in Latin America, the countries that are really, really driving the process, right, from the number of deals to the value of transactions, it's two. It's really Mexico and Brazil's the one that really drives the process, right? So, and Brazil is so large, and I think it's had a lot more international investors for a much longer time in a sophisticated stock market. So, look, I think they stand to win. It'll just be interesting to see what happens with Lula and their interaction with this administration, and whether what will happen. I know that clearly Trump is making a point of we need to protect ourselves. They're concerned about the Chinese, and the Chinese have been investing significantly in Latin America over yeah. So it's been a while now, right? And there's been a lot of Chinese influence in the region. So, that might be an area. Like, I think there's a lot on President Trump's plate right now and a lot to consider. And this may not be at the highest levels. Like, there might be other things, obviously, that he's taking care of. But I think there's going to be a point during this administration where he's going to really focus on LATAM, just from a strategic and security point of view. Like, how can he protect himself given, again, LATAM's proximity to the US.
Yeah, and I think nominating Secretary of State Rubio, that's indicative of he's not going to ignore the region, but I do think that I agree. I think Argentina stands to benefit quite a bit. I think there will be potentially bilateral agreements between the two countries that will be mutually beneficial. To open up more trade between the countries. I do also think Mexico, so far, if the president responds and continue, I read an article the other day that she sort of, I don't want to say stood up to him, but she spoke to him in a way that impressed him, like she's tough, the president of Mexico. And I think that they could work through some differences in order to benefit both countries. And I'm also curious. I know that it's, you talk about Argentina in the 80s and 90s, and I remember Venezuela in the 80s and 90s, and it was just a tremendous country with, all the natural resources in the world. And, there were so many U.S. companies in there. And what's happened in Venezuela, obviously, is, it's set itself back so many years. But I'm wondering, and I know that we're going a little bit off topic, we're not talking M&A, but I think that there's some optimism among certain people in the Venezuelan business community in Venezuela, where they potentially see an opening, right? Obviously, a deal would have to be made. Maduro probably, won't be, won't be there, but Venezuela has a lot to offer in terms of natural resources for the United States.
Absolutely agree with that. Yeah, no, I absolutely look, and it's a shame, right? Because it has a lot to offer. It's so close to the U.S. But it does have a significant amount of, and look, I think you saw it under the Biden administration where there was a softening on their stance as it related to Venezuela, and I think that was the start of it. And, I'm sure trying to get more petroleum into the U.S. to reduce prices in anticipation of the election was, probably, push that decision, further along. But to your point, I think there is some, people are optimistic that something may happen in a positive manner there. And hopefully relationships improve there, and there's more improved communication, because that'd be great to see.
That would be great to see.
Yeah.
Well, listen, we are at the end. I could talk to you on and on about this. There's so many there's so much happening right now. It's almost like, let's talk now. Let's talk in 6 months. It might be a different conversation.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. No,
because things are moving so fast.
I've absolutely enjoyed my time with you. I always do. It's always great chatting with you. You're absolutely phenomenal, and you do a lot of work in the region. So you're incredibly sophisticated, and you know the region really well, and you have a ton of clients. And I've had the opportunity to work with you, and clients have as well, and they rave about you. But it's been great chatting with you, and appreciate the opportunity to be here, and look forward to chatting some more down the road.
Yeah, I appreciate all your kind words. I don't want to let you go just yet, because we do have a tradition here in this podcast. We've been doing this podcast now for about 2 years, and we always finish with a lighter note. And I always ask my guests a question that has to do with one of my favorite topics, and that is music. I'm passionate about music. So let's talk about, I'm going to ask you a question about music. So we just had the Super Bowl, right? Last week, the Eagles and the Chiefs. Eagles blew the Chiefs out. Not much to, unless you're an Eagles fan, not much to enjoy about the game, if you're just a neutral fan. But the one thing that everyone was talking about, it seemed, the day after, was a halftime performance by Kendrick Lamar, right? So, and according to some data I read, it is the most watched halftime performance in the history of the Super Bowl. Yes. And controversial, right? People are both. So I'm not going to ask you where you stand on the Kendrick Lamar performance. I'm not going to ask you where you stand on the Kendrick Lamar and Drake beef that's been happening for years.
Well, I was going to wear my A minor diamond encrusted necklace. I
would have loved that. I would have loved that. But I do want to ask you sort of a broader question, and just kind of thinking about Super Bowl halftime performances. There have been so many through the years. Do you have a favorite Super Bowl halftime performance?
So it's funny. One, it's a great question. Two, I'm trying to, like, you, it is a great question. I'm trying to think back. I can't say that one stands out, and I'll tell you why. Usually with the games, I'm with, we usually, a bunch of us usually get together, friends of mine, and, we haven't seen each other for a long time. So during the game, we're diehard competitive. We love sports, and we grew up watching sports. So, we have a great time watching the sports, even if it's not our favorite teams. Like, we're just picking everything apart and talking about it. And then as soon as the halftime show comes on, we're off grilling or doing other things, and we're not really watching it. So I don't have a favorite. I can't tell you that, wow, it blew me away. But I know there's so much pageantry, and there's so much time goes into it. But I'll turn it back on you. Do you have a favorite halftime show?
Yeah, I mean, there have been so many. I think that the one, I did a little bit of research, so I have, so that's, to my benefit, I have a little bit more information about it. But I think in 1993, it was the first time that they brought in, a global superstar, and that's when they had Michael Jackson perform in the Super Bowl. And after that, you started to see, much more investment in who they brought in. And actually, I did not know this, but the NFL does not pay the performer to perform. They pay for all of the production and everything, but the performer does not get paid to put. I didn't know that either. But listen, I mean, and this is probably a very popular opinion. I remember when Prince performed in I think it was 2017, maybe, in Miami, and I remember. It began to rain. It was, I think the Colts were playing the Saints. I don't know if I have that right. And Prince played, and it started to rain, and he's performed Purple Rain, and it was just like, you can't even script that. And not only that, I mean, that was an amazing, but the whole performance was incredible. But the other one I do remember was right after 9/11. U2 was asked to perform, and U2 played. One of the songs that they played was Where the Streets Had No Name. And as they were performing, they were scrolling up these banners that had the name of every victim of 9/11.
That's wonderful.
It was so powerful. And I remember at the very end when he finished the song, he opened his jacket and it was like the inline of the jacket was the American flag.
That's phenomenal.
So those two jump out.
You typically don't have this effect on me, even though I admire you, but I just got goosebumps. But I've got to look that one up. That's phenomenal.
It is. It was incredible. And I mean, it was just such a tribute.
Yeah. So it's funny. So I do love YouTube and Prince, like two of my favorite. Like YouTube is such a great band, and Prince is just a phenomenal entertainer and musician.
Yeah.
So you probably picked two of my favorites. And now I'm going to look it up. So when I get some time later today, I'll look at those.
I'm surprised that you were grilling when Shakira and J-Lo were performing.
Hey, there's some priorities. You have to prioritize, with the limited amount of time. I will tell you one music tidbit, completely unrelated to this, but since we're talking about music. So I'm really excited. So, one of the more important things to me, in addition to being a great attorney and helping my clients, is my faith in God and my family. So I had my wife and my 3 daughters, and two of the girls. My oldest plays the cello, and she's very good at it. One of the twins plays a violin, and she's actually picked it up, and she doesn't practice often, but she does. She plays it fairly well, and she's starting to get excited and passionate about it. And then the other twin has done the piano, didn't really like it, then tried the flute for a year or so, didn't like it. And I said to her, you know what? I need to spend more time with all 3 of you, but I will spend a little bit more time with you. How about you and I take piano lessons together? So she and I are going to, as sort of dad-daughter bonding session.
Right.
It's a challenge for me. I've never played the piano. And it's funny. I just looked at some videos on YouTube, like how to quickly learn the piano. It doesn't look easy. So
there's no quickly learn the piano.
There's no quickly learning this. So
no.
It's going to take a lot of what I preach to them, a lot of work and sacrifice and discipline.
Yeah.
But I'm so excited, Alberto. It's an opportunity for me to spend some quality, put the phone aside, no emails, no text messages, and just put the phone aside and spend some time with her. And so she's so excited about it, and so am I. But I'm doing that starting this Saturday.
Oh, good. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's phenomenal. Okay, so we're done. I just want to the audience, thank you for once again tuning in. If you like the podcast, please click on the link below. And Nicholas, I want to thank you. You're just an exceptional individual and such a professional, all the time, 24/7. I always enjoy chatting with you as well. And stay tuned to the audience for the next podcast. And always glad to bring you top-notch guests each and every month. Thank you.